Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Solar Embrace, Chapter 11, Innocence Lost. It hadn't even been late afternoon when the pair of them had fallen asleep, and yet for Celestia waking up that morning seemed harder than any other she had ever endured. It was not because she was hungry, for she had eaten well that day before. It was not because she was thirsty, for drinking from a nearby babbling brook would quench her parched throat. There was no real wind to speak of it, so it was quiet up in the above alcove. The sun still shone that morning, bright as ever, yet the light did not penetrate the full depth of their sleeping spot, and as such it did not shine in her eyes. It was a hard morning to wake up to, because once more she could hear a voice in her head, softly whispering to her as she stretched her well-rested body on the mat of moss beneath her. "It seems you miscalculated," her conscience said softly, causing the alicorn to rub her temples in weariness and frustration. "The hour is upon you. Soon enough the world's fate will be sealed by what happens in these next few hours." "Hours? I thought I had days left, not hours," the alicorn said softly to herself. "Surely my calculations were not off by that much." "It is not your original calculations that were off, for they would have been true, save for the one troublesome feature. You know as well as I do that stars are finicky beasts," her inner voice said, sounding far more serious than usual. "Creatures of this world, both sapient and not, know nothing of the true nature of space. Stars are not alive in a conscious manner, but they still give birth, live, and die like so many other things in creation. Even now, the sun we are attached to is restless, eager to shred a burden it has been carrying for 1,000 years. The pent-up energy I have kept at bay," Celestia whispered sadly. "Yes, when she had first come to Earth, there had been wilder and more violent weather patterns due to an excess in solar spots on other sun-related phenomenon. After assuming direct control of the sun's power on an initiate scale, Celestia had done much to stem the violent shifts in its mood, usually by releasing some of the excess energy out towards other parts of the solar system. After the utter fiasco with her first heat, she had severely cut back on the energy she allowed to leave the sun. And so now, after all these centuries, it was finally time for the sun to release all that energy in one great burst. "Indeed," her inner voice said, sounding faint already, as if fading away into nothing. "It will begin to break free from the hold you have kept it in for this entire lifespan, and the instant you fall into your heat, your bonds will be gone completely. Even worse, because the sun is connected to you, all of its releasing energy will be directed towards you. Only a miracle on your part, perhaps some part of your ascended self, or some deep, innate magic, can stem the tide that will wash over this planet." "Don't go, please," Celestia said with a soft cry, knowing that it was useless. She never talked much with her conscience over the course of her life, but she had already talked with it twice on this island. Now it was again reminding her of her failure, but strangely also of a solution. Maybe it was inadvertent, maybe it was planned. Either way, Celestia knew she had an option she hadn't been privy to before. Ascension. If she had had enough time, she could have done it long ago, safely and far from the innocence of her kingdom and this world. Thus, by her ascended will alone, the sun's eventual release would have been harmlessly flung off into some other portion of space. This island was secluded enough, but time was not on her side. To do it quickly would require an utterly massive amount of magic, both innate and external. And the only question was, did she have what it takes? No. To concentrate as much as she would need to, She would have to enter a meditative trance that would have almost resembled death to an outside observer. That alone took weeks, and now, once again, she would be unable to do what she needed to be done. This might have crippled her decision-making process when she first arrived on the island, but, as it seemed, like all other times Spike offered a solution he did not know of. It could be done, with her external magic now at full power, and his innate as strong as would be needed. But after it was done, he would never be the same. How could he be, having been transformed to save the world? Surely, it couldn't be too difficult to get Spike to go along with what she was planning, right? They had already come so far, and all that needed was a little push. Push in the right direction. Yet, the fact that she would be coercing Spike to undergo such a radical change, even for the purpose of saving the world, it slightly unsettled her. Scratch that, it worried her. She knew in her heart that their relationship was forever changed, and she indeed did love the sweet dragon lying beside her. She didn't want to outright admit it, since it seemed terribly cliché, almost like something out of a cheesy romance novel. A pair of strangers falling madly in love with one another over the course of a few days. Some would call it preposterous, an example of poor writing. Celestia would have agreed with them before, but now she didn't know. What she felt was real, and she was most certain that Spike felt the same. But, wow. It was just so hard making decisions sometimes when your heart and your head were conflicted. She could no more lie to Spike than she could dismiss his feelings for her. And after looking down at his serene features, she knew what she had to do. She had to tell him, not the secret, but of another, one she had her kind had harbored for very, very long. "Spike," she said gently, pressing her palm into his shoulder and giving him a gentle shake, noticing how sweet he looked lying on his side. The dragon mumbled in his sleep. "Spike, could you wake up, please?" the princess asked softly, knowing full well the impact of her next decision could permanently alter what Spike thought of not only her, but of alicorns in general. The dragon mumbled again, slowly opening his eyes and giving a great big yawn. "Yes, what is it, Celestia?" "Spike, I need to tell you something," she said softly, looking away from him and hugging her knees to her chest. "Something you should have known long ago, when you were far younger and more likely to forgive." "Forgive?" Spike asked, sounding not only still a bit sleepy, but also a tad confused. "Spike, do you remember when I showed you the history of the primordials, and then the dragons? Everything she had shown him that day was the truth, and she was glad for it. But there was some things she had chosen not to reveal. Now is the time." Rocking softly back and forth on the bed of moss next to her lover, Celestia knew it was time. Yeah, I kinda remember," the dragon said softly. "Wea and all that. Do you remember what you asked me after we were done?" the alicorn whispered softly, a very light blush forming over her features. She had thought back to each day and every session they had ever partaken in since coming onto this island, and she cherished each and every one in its own special way. "Oh, before or after we started touching each other?" "Right before. Yeah, I wanted to know about the alicorns, and you said you'd tell me some other time." Spike had no idea why Celestia looked so, what was the word, depressed? No, more like wary. This journey, both of the physical and mental state, was taking its toll on the princess. That much was evident. Who would have thought that going to this island in order to save the world could be so exhausting for her? Even though they had been gone, a week? Not even that long. Time sure seemed to behave oddly when you were stuck on an island with only a beautiful alicorn mare for company. "Did you ever think why I kept you in the dark on such a matter?" Celestia asked, glancing back at Spike. "Did you perhaps wonder why I decided to not enlighten you on my own kind's history that afternoon?" No, I didn't really," the dragon replied, propping a leg up and leaning on his knee. "What's this all about?" "Spike, what I'm about to tell you is something few outside the Alicorn race know to be certain, and something that, once upon a time, could have triggered a war across the universe." Spike gulped at that. Wow, that was, well, big. Was a bit of a grand understatement in describing a bombshell like that. Okay. "Long ago, Spike, countless generations before I was born, when the Alicorns ascended to their astral forms, the powers of the dragons was absolute, stretching to every corner of the universe," Celestia said softly. "We Alicorns actually originally came from Earth, you see, but during that time it was ruled by the most favored creations of the dragons, a race far mightier than any non-sapient group of creatures had ever been before." "What?" Spike asked. "Dinosaurs," the princess said simply. "They were handcrafted over their many millions of years of evolution to be the successors to the throne of dragons, whom they saw as mere images of themselves. The throne would have been theirs even without the help of the dragons, eventually anyway. It was believed that the throne could be passed to whomever ascended as the species, and with the right amount of time, dinosaurs surely would have been the next in line to the universal throne. The dragons who supported such a measure were moderately few in numbers, but very influential. Those that did not support such a stacking the deck approach, the universe succession remained quiet about it." "I'm guessing the Alicorns were not fans of such a plan?" Spike asked, wondering where this was going. "Exactly," Celestia said. "There were countless other worlds that teemed with life at the time, but none had gone so far as these pet projects of the dragons. We Alicorns had somehow ascended to primitive forms, without having initially dominated our own home world, as primordials did with their own so long ago, before the dragons came into being. We were not accepted by the dragons as equals, but as possible yet harmless competitors. To prevent possible wars, we kept our heads down, biding our time and playing off that we were simply blessed by good fortune. We were congratulated on our ascensions, but given no real thought as to how we might be destined for the universal throne." "What happened?" Spike asked, feeling a sense of dread radiating off of Celestia in waves. "The Alicorns. They decided it was time for the rule of dragons to be over. After centuries upon centuries of planning, a few years in the life of an Alicorn, they plotted it all out. Mammals started evolving larger and faster than the dragons had anticipated, and as such were becoming more than a mere nuisance to the dinosaurs, for which they cared for. Global climate patterns continued to shift in almost random ways, and all over the world more and more volcanoes were erupting. Diseases were springing up in places they had never been before. In so short of a time, the earth was becoming ripe for a change, something the dragons were hoping for. It was not the first time the dinosaurs had faced such adversity, and after an initial die-off, they would have come back stronger as a whole from such a natural change. The only thing was, the change that came was something they or the dragons never saw coming. What was it? High in the Himalayas, there was a mountain called Mount Evernest, a place long since revered by griffins as a holy site. It was the tallest mountain in the world, stretching nearly 6 miles into the sky. In the year of the change, the Alicorns had found an asteroid heading toward Earth, the same size as the mountain. Originally, by their calculations, it would have missed the planet entirely. With the combined might of every single living Alicorn at the time, their magic was not only enough to shove it the merest few miles one way for its path to change enough, but to enshroud it in a barrier that would keep it hidden from the sight of dragons until it was too late. "Oh my," Spike muttered. The asteroid hit with so great a force that the dragons who witnessed it could not believe what was happening. By our standards of life, in a mere fortnight, the reign of the dinosaurs was over. They were rendered extinct by all of what the alicorns had been doing to the Earth: climatic change, a surge in mammals, tectonic instability, and rampant disease, all of which was combined with a magical enshrouded asteroid, ended the reign of the dragon's successors. "What happened afterwards?" the dragon asked, feeling something rather strange in his gut. Outrage? Disbelief? Possibly even horror? Not at Celestia, or even at the alicorns for doing the deed, but at the fact that they had found themselves unable to do anything but such a thing. That they had been backed into a corner by the dragons, and had lashed out in the only way they saw possible. The dragons retreated in shame from such a disaster, though many suspected that it was not just coincidence. We had come onto the scene right before such a calamity. Such troublemakers were silenced by our kind through generous acts of kindness, such as almost single-handedly ensuring the rebuilding of Earth's countless ecosystems and helping relocate the dragons living on Earth who no longer wanted part of it. However, some dragons remained behind, and those that did were the most notorious for, correctly, I might add you, blaming alicorns for the destruction of the dinosaurs. They saw it as a slight to their honor, and you should know plenty about Dragon's Code of Honor. Yes, well, mostly, Spike said softly, his mind still struggling to accept that Celestia's ancestors had once wiped the planet, their own ancestral home, clean of good portion of life. It would seem that alicorns were not as pure as he had been led to believe, a substantial reversal in this outlook on life, and yet it did really matter in the end if they were or were not perfect. Celestia had told him herself that she was far from perfect, and that the pedestal ponies placed her on was indeed a hard one to live on. As such, the living descendants of almost all of those dragons still harbor deep, often unexplainable, grudges against all ponies, especially alicorns. None living today know why they feel that way, but they accept it as a part of their instinct that will hold on to such a tradition. That only a dragon raised amongst the ponies may feel differently. That is why you are so special, Spike. You are descended from those same dragons, yet you harbor none of this disdain or arrogant pride they are so filled with. Well, that made sense to Spike. Other dragons he had met did seem to dislike ponies, but exactly why had never occurred to him. Here he had always thought other dragons were just full of themselves or something. This explanation had also seemed to be the reason why ponies knew so little about dragons. Why even try to talk with something that hates you, even if you never done them wrong? Then, what happened after the cleanup and such, he asked. Over the many millions of years since then, the dragons retreated farther and farther from ruling the universe as alicorns continued to expand. Though with nowhere near the same over or underhand tactics we had used originally. Eventually, at exactly 5 million years before the birth of my father, Lord Polaris, we were officially granted the title as inheritors of the universe's mantle. Though by that time we had an undisputed reign for many more millions of years. How do you know the exact date? I mean, even for an alicorn, 5 million years is quite a long time in the history of your kind, Spike said. Still, he had no idea how long alicorns lived. But if he had to guess, it was measured in tens of thousands of years, and even then 5 million years. That was still a good many lifetimes. I remember it because it was a great day for my family. Our family's most famous progenitor, Lord Nebulae, accepted the mantle for the longest-lived dragon at the time. Celestia knew full well the history of her family and her species, from the humble origins and bloodthirsty rise to power down to now, or to how kind and benevolent they had become since then. Her own family could trace itself as far as Lord Nebulae. After that, the waters of history became a bit muddied, seeing as none of their race truly knew Nebulae's origins. Had he been a minor noble, whose line was destined for power solely because of his birth, or had he been simple low-born, whose bravado, skill, and intelligence had earned him a title? No pony knew, and deep in her heart, Celestia wanted to believe it was more of the latter. Okay, so I guess that would be a big deal, the dragon said. How is the Alicorn society? We were a kingdom once, long before our ascension, but after we became the celestial rulers we are now, we formed a council. Nobility, gentry, and such titles are still bestowed upon Alicorns they are in any of the Earth's cultures. Yet the lowliest Alicorns is still greater in power than the mightiest unicorn in the world. All Alicorns from all walks of life, no matter title or parentage, are respected within our society, for we see chances of unity where others see possibilities of dispute and division. It is strange, I must admit, but after these years you are the first one to know so much of our society outside of an actual Alicorn. I have not told any pony else as much as I have told you, not even Twilight Sparkle. My mother, Lady Aether, would likely disapprove of telling the ponies of my kingdom and such things. I must abide by her wishes, but I know that she cares enough to tell me such things, and I thank her for that. Then, why do you sound so sad? Spike asked, noticing a tear forming in the corner of Celestia's eye. I'm honored that you would tell me this, even if your parents wouldn't necessarily approve of it. You are not upset? Not even a little? She asked with a soft gasp, turning to look at her lover with a mixture of bewilderment and gratitude. Why would I be upset? Spike asked, putting one arm around her shoulders and pulling her into a gentle hug, making sure to not poke himself in the eye as his chin rested on her head. Because we Alicorns so dishonor dragons in our quest to assume what we thought ours. The mantle of this universe, the princess said softly, swiftly burying her face into the crook of his neck. She would not cry. She would not. We destroyed what would have been your kind's legacy and the dinosaurs. We stole their future. We were not even sure we were ready for the title, but our ancestors, they craved it so that they cared not for whom they hurt. I bear the sins of their quest, and all of my kind does, deep within our souls. Celestia, what does it matter in the end who did what, and how I think of them? Why would I blame you for something your kind did millions upon millions of years ago? Spike asked gently, patting her on the back of the head. Even though the events themselves were almost too terrible to contemplate, Spike was not far from removed from them. Then it didn't really matter. Why would I even be mad about such a thing anyway? None of the ponies I know are still mad about the pony wars that happened before the event of Hearthwarming Eve. when Earth and a unicorn and Pegasus armies did battle over land and prestige. I know, but surely there is some part of you, some small part of you that is just the teensiest bit mad at me from keeping this from you. Celestia needed this. She needed to be just let out of the sins her kind to this one kind soul, if only because she needed clarity on her tortured soul's wishes. Celestia, do you still think that just because I'm a dragon that I'd act like other dragons? Hasn't our time together on this island proven that wrong? Spike was not upset, but he was a bit disappointed, to tell the truth. He was a dragon, true, but raised by ponies, unless ponies had done something utterly terrible, such as kill his dragon parents. Then he would likely never find himself against them. Even the destruction of the dinosaurs, though likely a sore spot in the hearts of many dragons, meant little to him. And to be honest, he wasn't exactly sure, though, that he would have approved such either decisions. Rigging this sort of universal ascendancy game seemed to be just wrong, and even with the purest of intentions, such a line of thought could lead to very dark things. Who was to say who should inherit something that was meant to be a reward for achieving the greatest of successes? On the other hand, killing off the dinosaurs to establish one species as rightful heirs to the ascended plane was also a terrible thing, perhaps even more so than rigging such a system. Spike could perhaps see why dragons wished for dinosaurs to be their successors. Well, they were so closely associated with one another, given the general universal appearance, that many scholars used to think the two were closely related. Dinosaurs could have been the first to arise from their home planet since the primordials themselves, as dragons were the offspring of Huea, the hatchling of the stars. To just kill them off, just to take off their throne, seemed almost evil. But ever since then, alicorns had done so much good for the universe, and Earth especially. Perhaps deep in their hearts, the very first alicorns had been sorry for the destruction they had wrought. Perhaps that was why, according to Celestia, they had given so much to help rebuild the planet after all the destruction. In Spike's mind, he had already forgiven them, and for what Celestia had told him, he had no doubt their descendants had more than made up for the mistakes in their past. He knew it would be important one day to just talk to both sides on the issue, if it were possible, but as they sat in silence, Spike knew he needed to tell Celestia the truth. I love you, Celestia. I truly love you, and I want you to know that no matter what past troubles your kind has had with mine, I will still love you. Celestia's mind reeled in shock from his words. She had suspected, she had hoped, but had she truly known he'd tell her such a thing? Had she truly known he would tell her that he loved her? No, she had not known. She had hoped, dreamed, wished for it, but she had never been certain he would tell her such a thing. Yes? Spike asked, drawing her back a little so he could look into her eyes. He could see something else in her eyes, something he didn't see when he usually looked into them. There was another side of Celestia, one only he had become privileged enough to witness, and right now it was gazing back at him in full force. There was the princess, and there was the alicorn, and then there was the mare. But to him, there was only Celestia, and he saw her for her true self. I love you too, Spike, Celestia said, pulling him in for a powerful hug, her lips mashing against his own, in time with her breasts pressing against his chest. Okay, Spike had not expected her to just up and do that, but he wasn't going to complain. He kissed her back, pulling against her as well, as her hot breath mangled with his. Their tongues, previously occupied with only forming words, now did battle with one another in such a flurry of moves that the most skilled of poets could only dream of such martial prowess, flicking over one another along the outside of each other's teeth, touching tips and sides and underneath and everywhere else. Their kiss was something of a marvel in itself. Not only were they kissing, but what little frustration, regrets, and apprehensiveness they had left within themselves flowed out of their bodies, which, suffice to say, were becoming quite aroused. Spike could feel his princess lover's breast pressing on his own chest, their puffy nipples rubbing against his scales as they moved against one another. He could feel her heartbeat in time with his own, increasing and strong, yet still measured and in sync with their moving bodies. Celestia, on the other hand, could feel something hard and soft and very warm sliding up against her, and for once in a very long while her heart and her head were in agreement instantly. She needed him to make love to her, as they had never done so before. "Spike," she said softly, after pulling apart from their kiss, surprised she could even speak, given how breathless she was. I think it's time." "Time? Time for what?" the dragon asked, his features a bit flushed and his eyes heavy-lidded. Time for you to make a real mare out of me," the Alicorn princess said, gazing into her lover's eyes. "It's time for you to take away my virginity and yours in one swift stroke. How do you want to do this?" "How to do it? What do you mean? Isn't it rather simple?" Spike asked, his brain struggling to process the implications and meaning of the word. "It goes in, for added effect." He pointed from his cock to Celestia's pussy, rather close together already, but still he needed a clarification, if only to assure himself. "Do you want me to be on top, or should I?" It was one of the hardest questions the princess had ever had to ask, not because she didn't want this, or that she thought Spike didn't want it. She knew both of them wanted it more than anything. No, it was hard to ask because, for being a virgin, this was practically all she knew about the actual parenting or penetrating sex. She had overheard his countless times by her staff when they thought she wasn't listening, and as such she had always been curious as to why some chose top over bottom. Did it really make a difference in the end? But what exactly is top for you anyway? The dragon asked. I think top for me would just be like when you lay on your back with, meshing your parts. Even after all they had been through so far, both emotionally and physically, Spike still felt a bit uneasy trying to talk sex with the princess. His princess. I think it'd be similar to that, only with me meshing down on you, the Alicorn said softly, rising up a bit on her knees. All the way up, she felt his straightening erection graze past her taut stomach, and even though just barely brushed the lowest part of her lips before she reached her full kneeling height, she peered down past her breasts and the throbbing thing before her. A sight of it filled her with burning, itching desire to see it disappear in her body. Do you think it will hurt a lot?" I don't know," Spike said, his eyes locked into hers, as his hands drifted up the sides of her flexed thighs. Do you want me to massage you first? Maybe loosen you a bit?" Celestia thought about it, undoubtedly, even though neither of them knew truly much of it. She would feel pain during her first time, however. The fact that Spike was offering to try and ease it ahead of time only made her love him all that more. "No, Spike, I don't want you to loosen me up. she said softly, her hands reaching down and meshing with his own, and her nipples hardened on instinct. I want this to be special, okay? Just you and me making true love for the first time. Okay. The dragon said his words on octave above a whisper. The certainty in her voice filled him with a confidence he wouldn't have normally assumed he'd lack, especially in a situation like this. That and her bulging breasts in front of his face did wonders to erase any sort of concern that might he have had. Just go when you're ready. I'll be there for you. You need anything? Biting her lower lip, Celestia began to slowly lower herself, the pulsating tip of Spike's cock inching closer and closer to her glistening marehood. Sooner than she'd thought had he grown longer, her moist lips were touching the very tip of her mushroom cap. Give her shivering as a small pulse of feeling, all of it good, swept through her system. Celestia noticed something. Spike's dick was pulsating from the blood flowing through it, and even though he was not yet inside her, she could feel his heartbeat send little shock waves into her system. They had made contact. Letting her weight drop down a little, Celestia watched as the head pressed itself firmly against her lips, but it did not go in. She was so tight, so unearthly tight after all those years. She couldn't even get his dick inside her. She wanted it, needed it inside her, and it just wouldn't go in. She was ruining it. She was ruining their first time. Oh, she was just horrible lover who couldn't even just push a little harder, Spike said, watching the flurry of emotions running across her lover's face. I heard this part would be hard at first. You just need a bit of effort, Celestia. I don't want to hurt you, though. His words trailed off, the unsaid implications left hanging in the air between them. Spike, I think you're the last being I know of who would ever want to hurt me, Celestia said, laughing in spite of herself. Now help me get your dick in my pussy. Spike's internal temperature must have jumped a good 50 degrees at hearing Celestia talk dirty, and even though it didn't, he could have sworn he saw his dick swell to a good 2 inches in length and a good another inch in girth. If she had kept talking dirty to him, she might pass out from the amount of blood that... he might pass out from the amount of blood that would leave his brain. Or his dick might burst a blood vessel. Either way, it'd hurt. Just push down a little harder, was all he could say. Celestia let more of her weight fall her wings stiff behind her, yet still laying flat against her back. More pressure, more force, inching closer, so closer to her goal. Her mouth hung agape, her salivary glands in overdrive, as her heart began thumping all the way up to her throat. A little more force, just a bit more, come on, it wouldn't take much more there. In a sudden squelching noise, the cap of Spike's dick all the way up to his swollen glands, piercing her virgin cunt and traveling up inside her. Stopping almost immediately, Celestia tensed up, and a sharp piercing pain tore through her midsection, like a tree branch being blown apart by a bitterly cold winter morning. Only this wasn't cold, it was hot, hotter than she'd ever thought possible, and it was searing her insides. She was the princess of the sun, and the heat pooling in her belly, dancing on her nerves and coursing in one very specific spot of her body, was making her rethink everything she thought she knew about temperature. Spike's reaction seemed to mirror hers, though his thought process was rather different. He too felt the heat, but to him there wasn't so much pain as there was tightness. His dick, even though just the head had gone in, felt as though it were in a vice. the softest, warmest, most unearthly vice anything had ever been put into. He felt as though his stomach had tried to swallow his lungs, pushing almost every last bit of air out of them. It was as though his entire being was being compressed into a tight tube. Celestia looked down to see the head of Spike's cock completely within her. In dribbling down the sides of his shaft, he saw trickles of blood, her virgin blood. The sight willed her to go on, to see this all the way through, biting her lip even harder and shifting back to the combination of a moan and a cry. She let herself sink further onto that piercing shaft, that throbbing, piercing meat, that utterly invasive foreign object. Spike could barely breathe as he watched the princess lover sink lower and lower onto him. The slight scent of her taken virginity filling his nostrils and making his head spin. His cock had started producing pre-cum, as it had learned to do in excess on this island, but right now, even as he could somehow feel it gushing from the tip, he could focus only on Celestia. She looked as though she was in pain, and that made him feel pain. He didn't want to hurt her. She was doing this to herself, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. He wasn't sure if he even could bring himself to try. Every inch that slid further to Celestia made it harder and harder for her to breathe. The pain, the stretching, the heat, it was all conspiring against her, growing and growing as she slid her lover's dick further inside her. Her stomach, she was certain it was bulging below her eyes, her vessels being filled by that monster of a cock. She couldn't do it. She couldn't do this. It was too much. The heat, the pain, and the stretching him. She came to a stop, her body unwilling to lower itself any more. She looked down, and, though tears saw reason, her thighs were now resting entirely on Spike's own. And his shaft, it was completely gone. She had taken the whole thing inside her, every last inch of it, and she could feel it. Could she ever feel it, just sitting in her, pulsing quickly, in time to not only Spike's raised heartbeat, but her own? It felt so large, so dominating, that somehow, even in the midst of all this pain and heat, she could feel it had gone in as far as she could let it go. If there was any more room left for it to go in somehow deeper than she gauge, she couldn't feel it. Her vessels was clamped down so tight on this meaty invader that she was in shock that fluid could even escape from the Union. And escape it did. Dribbles of blood, her freely given virginity flowed freely out of her body. Her lowest lips felt as though they would have been torn. Should Spike's cock have been any thicker, they were indeed very red and puffy, and seemingly stretched to the absolute limit. The trailing liquid from their union not only dribbled down onto her lover's legs, but trailed along the underside of Celestia's own thighs like rainwater on the bottom of a tree branch. She felt the throbbing cock inside of her twitch, and that broke her concentration. With a muffled cry, tears flowed freely from her eyes, and the princess buried her face into the crook of her lover's neck, weeping softly. She had done it. She had fit that monster inside of her, and now she was no longer a virgin. She was a mare, unbred, but no more a pure, innocent flower. That remains of her precious flower were very clear on the lap of her lover. Spike held the princess close as she cried, doing his best to console her without being evident of it. He would barely concentrate on the task at all, given just how hard it was for him to even see at this point. His vision was slightly hazy, from the feeling of being squeezed by his lover, and as his hands gently rubbed up and down Celestia's back, he began to murmur to his beloved, "It's all right, my love. Don't cry. Please, don't cry. It's okay. You're safe here, safe in my arms." Celestia didn't know why, but Spike's soft, gentle tones, even in the midst of their love-making, had made her feel comforted. It was reminiscent of a gentle, caring touch, a touch she had not known in far too long a time. Spike was going to be her world now. She was his already, it seemed, and nothing would change that. His friends, his family, her court, indeed all of Equestria would have to get used to the fact that Celestia had a dragon lover, a young, strapping, handsome, and utterly adoring dragon lover. "Spike, I love you," she croaked, wiping away a few tears with one free hand. "I love you so much." "I know, Celestia. I love you too," Spike said softly as they looked into each other's eyes once again. Their bodies still hummed with the energy between them, and deep in Celestia's belly she could feel something changing. Her pain. It was still there, but it was diminishing with every second that ticked by. The heat remained, but replacing the pain there was something else. A sense of accomplishment, a feeling of being filled with the chance that she may yet be filled with something else, perhaps very soon. Her heat had started. She could feel something very small, yet filled with incredible potential, drop from the special part of her body into another part. She was ready for plucking. Her fertility was at its peak, and now that her body was responded in kind, it was finally time. It was time for her to become a mother. All the other thoughts filled her mind at this realization. Plans, preparations, the urge to tell Spike about the ascension. It was all just gone. "Spike, please," she gasped softly as she felt him twitch again. "Please make love to me. Love like I am the only mare you'll ever have." She did not know if he would ever bed another, but she knew in her heart that even if he did, they would pale in comparison to her, and that comforted her. Spike felt his instincts kick in, but even as they urged him to pound away into the tight cunt, he did not let them control him. They wanted to. They so desperately wanted to, but this will had grown on the island into a steel trap that would not bend or break to a simple-minded desires. No, instead he pushed his lover slowly off of him, earning a few sharp cries from her. Then, after only removing an inch or two of himself from her, he gently pushed her back down, earning another series of gasps from Celestia. So this pattern repeated, punctuated by Celestia's soft squeals and Spike's infrequent grunts. At first it was tough going, but after a short while it became easier and easier to slide in and out of the Alicorn Princess. Perhaps it was due to all the natural lubrication she was exuding. Droves of it, in fact, ran down his cock, making it far slipperier than therefore easier to use. "Spike, I feel it inside me," Celestia said, her own hips beginning to instinctively duck downwards whenever Spike pushed her down onto him. Every thrust magnified that with the feeling inside, and deep within her something was building, an orgasm, her first ever, brought on by something so large being inside of her. The texture of his cock grinding against her insides, churning them into a soup of precum and royal juices. She felt as though she could no longer breathe. I'm getting closer." She was burning up inside, lost in the heart of their love-making. Her very soul was smoldering inside of her, connected to Spike's own through his personal union. And although this experience would not last forever, to her she would remember it always. I'm close too, I think," the dragon said, and for once he was right. He would almost have likely blown his load upon entering his lover, but something had stopped happened to him on this island, something he had not foreseen. All of their foreplay had been building up to this moment, and perhaps only now evident of the dragon, all of his sexual tensions had been expelled from his body. Year after year of living as a predominantly female town surrounded by predominantly female friends had greatly repressed his sexual growth in many ways. But now that Celestia had revealed to him so many times over these past few days where he once thought he would come in an instant, he was instead finding it almost a chore to even come at all. His balls hung against his body, sloshing, filled with the thick seed that of his kind, but he could no more will it to come out than he could move the mountain with his mind. They would come when they did, not to mention before, not a moment too late. Still, he could tell it was coming, with the soft vice-like grip of Celestia's pussy encasing his entire every second, or every few seconds. How could anyone hold out? Celestia's nerves danced inside of her body, started to shiver, softly spasming with every single stroke of Spike's cock into her. Every time he left her, even a little bit empty, it was as though every bit of her life energy was being drawn from her body, and when he pushed back in all the way to the hilt, she felt a new power surge within the confines of her vessels. Then, on one downstroke, she felt an extra push from Spike, his hips twitching upwards with a tad extra force. It must have been enough, for in an instant she saw spots in her vision and felt her wings extend to their fullest. Spike, Celestia cried out, and her vessels clamped down with all its might onto his cock within her, and in a flash her body succumbed to a powerful orgasm, and in an instant later she felt a warmth flood her insides. She looked down to see the dragon lover clench his jaw, his eyes shut, as his own orgasm hit him like a ton of bricks. Celestia felt his seed spill inside her, the warmth triggering what must have been something akin to an orgasm aftershocks. Even though her pussy continuously clenched and unclenched, seemingly trying to milk the dragon for all he was worth, she peered down to see his thick, creamy liquid dribble out from the union of the two onto both their thighs and his groin. They had done it. They had finally made sweet, sweet love, and the wary Celestia laid her body across her lover's, content to simply be with him. She did not even bother to remove him from her, and as his arms held her protectively against him, Celestia smiled at Spike. That was wonderful love, she said, her voice dreamy, and her eyes very doe-like. She even let out a silly little giggle, excited at the deed they had just done. Finally, neither of them could say they were virgins, and for Celestia it seemed like a long time coming. Yeah, was all Spike could say, his voice trailing off every other word. It seemed that was amazing. Indeed, judging from his body's suddenly spiking temperature, it knew something about him had changed. His balls, they felt funny, almost empty. Surely they couldn't have been too empty, as his body's response was suddenly kick sperm production into overdrive. He could almost feel that for sure. The two of them stayed like that, content to just lay there, awake and satisfied in each other's embrace. At least for a while, until Celestia kissed Spike's chin and whispered to her now pink eyes, looking right into his own, as a smile graced her lips. What do you think? When do you think we can go again? Meanwhile, space is cold, so cold that nearly all life cannot exist within its embrace. Dragons and the ascended race, that alicorns, are the exception to this rule, but other than them, the vacuum is nothing but a source of death. However, to some, the cold of space means nothing. Correction. It means less than nothing to an heir of the Big Bang. Stars were born in such darkness, often in clouds that were the remains of the ancestors. It was a cycle that had been growing on since the very beginning of a time. Since the very first stars filled space and died violent deaths. They were truly massive beasts, far larger than any star left today, and even though their heirs held neither the same power nor size, they still brought light to the darkness, an honor bestowed on only them. Oh gosh. As such, though, the remains of their ancestors were scattered across space and time. Eventually, one small bit of ancient star's corpse formed the very star with 9 unique planets in its embrace. There were those who called it outmost planets, not planets at all. Nowhere, or somewhere but to a star. Everything that orbited it was its own, and as such was free to call it whatever it wanted. It was not bound by terms of mortals, any more than it was bound by the power of the planets that orbited it. Where some saw gas giants, the sun could see a failed star. Where others saw a massive comet, the sun could see a small planet's. Semantics mattered little to the massive churning ball of gas, heat, and light, and any that truly argued with it were met with only cold silence. Within the ring of asteroids, there's one special star. There were 4 special planets, and one in particular was drawing its ire. It was a little blue speck that lived, one who controlled the sun, called Sol, and Sol, for a brief second in its life, but still a second too long, had been held back in unleashing its power across the solar system. It needed release, and the bounds that held it nearly shattered when it had least expected them to. But the sun was a patient thing, and instead of just immediately letting everything fly off, it gathered energy it was bound to release. It pulled it from over its surface to one spot in particular. The power grew and grew, almost mighty, and yet growing ever the mightier, until the sun no longer wished to keep it contained. In a soundless of space, a great upheaval of the sun sent forth a blazing pillar of energy and light arching through space, like a massive, sinuous bolt of lightning. Normally, such an event would have been traveling at nearly the speed of light, but for the sun some of those same bonds existed, and as such the energy moved far slower than it would have liked. But yet again the sun was patient, and even in the life of something as painfully short-lived as an alicorn, its released energy would find its target. The only thing left now was to watch and just see what would happen when all of that energy hit the earth in one particular spot, a tiny island off in the middle of nowhere. Would this beam of energy destroy the earth, or would a miracle happen? A miracle that the sun secretly hoped would occur. It was not a malevolent entity, and had a kinder side, but after all this time it did not know what would happen. It had to release the energy, and all of it had to go somewhere. All of it could do now was watch and wait and hope. Hope that one towards which the energy traveled would be able to do something about it before all was lost, and one little blue planet would survive the chaos. Author's note: well, that took long enough both for them to do it and for me to get the chapter published. God, I love writing history for this story. Anyways, a thought struck me. This story over 1,000 thumbs up and 60 thumbs down. My question is, why was this story thumbs down? Is it because it was anthro? I bet it's because it was anthro. And yes, for clarification purposes, Celestia and Luna's parents are named Lord Polaris and Lady Aether. By me, obviously. Until next time, see ya. I hope you guys have enjoyed. a wonderful time. Jesus Christ, our reading. Haven't done these in a long time. I'm sorry for the interruptions and my terrible reading, but anyways, have a wonderful day.